Hello, my fellow comic book collectors. This video, I'm going to look at a little bit of history in terms of which books, not comics, but which books actually influenced comics maybe the most in history. So these four books are quite interesting, and they had a huge impact on comics. Probably the one that I've gone on about the most is this one, The Seduction of Innocent. This is probably the most famous comic related book. It is a book that led to the Comic Code Authority, and it is one that had a major influence. So the four books that I'm looking at are in this same generation, where these are the ones that really led to the Comic Code Authority. So Seduction of the Innocent, I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis of it, was written by Frederick Wortham. He's basically he was a child psychologist, and he worked in New York and basically dealt with a lot of children that were in trauma, basically, either that they had done crimes or they were, in need of some kind of therapy. They were kind of messed up kids. And he noticed a pattern with those kids that a lot of them were reading comics. Okay? But you're probably thinking, well, a lot of kids read comics. Comics were the thing to do when you're a kid back in the 40s and 50s. But Wortham, as a he basically interpreted the stories that he heard from these kids as being what led to their downfall or led to their juvenile delinquency. So basically, this book summarizes it's sort of like anecdotal stories of different comics and how the children interpreted them and how they potentially got influenced by them in a negative way. So a lot of the stories in this are just these like short like there might actually be mentions of multiple comics within one page where he just sort of gives like sort of the highlights of what was in the comic and his thoughts on how that led to some kind of moral problems with the kids. So a famous one is where there is a scene where a blind man, and it's actually on the cover of the comic, a blind man is selling magazines, okay? And this guy steals from the blind man, okay? Because he can't see, so it's easy to steal the money from the blind man. So, these are the kind of moral things that more than felt that the comics were teaching people how to take advantage of their fellow man. He really particularly didn't like crime comics. So a lot of the comics that were featured in the Seduction of the Innocent were crime related. And if you're a collector like I am I call it Soti. I've heard it pronounced Sotai as well, but I say Soti, so I don't know if it's Soti or Sotai, but I always say Soti. But the way you collect, there's about 155 comics related to the Seduction of the Innocent, and the way it goes in terms of value is generally comics of the same era or same series or whatever generally are worth about 20% less than something that's mentioned in here. So just the fact that they were mentioned in here, you get collectors like me that seek them out. And if there's actually inside of Seduction Innocent, there's panels where there's lithos. And this is like, for example, Reformed Schoolgirl is one of the lithos. I'll kind of let you look at it for a bit so you can read all the stuff. So this is an example. I actually have that behind me. I think you can see it. I'm trying to point to it. I'm always bad at this reverse pointing thing. There. There. And I point more there. Okay, so kind of that way. Okay, so it's a pretty pricey book because it was mentioned in one of the pictures, and you got like different pictures from the interior art for some of the comics. So this one, for example, shows all the vulnerable spots where you can hurt somebody on this side, and then you got other things where it shows bloodletting. Or he really didn't like a lot of things where it was injury to eye, and part of the reason for that was he felt like kids are very easily influenced by comics, and if they see something like injury to eye, they might try to do it to their friends, thinking that they're imitating the comics, and it's very easy for them to actually hurt somebody because the eyes are very vulnerable. So a lot of the stuff is injury to eye. And then you can see some of these. I'll try to show some of the panels inside. Here's a great one. This is one of the more famous ones. This is the hot poker one. I'll kind of zoom in so you can see. So these are some of the interesting ones. This is the panel for Strange Adventures, where I think this is sort of like a prototype for Gorilla Gaunt, but it's just like this intelligent gorilla that basically smacks two police officers' heads together. And then we get Phantom Lady, another famous famous one. Another thing that Wortham liked to go on about was headlight covers. So this is an example of a Matt Baker headlight cover. Matt Baker seems to be featured a lot in here. And this is another one. This is from Sally the Sleuth down here. This one is from Crime Smashers #1. And it's like a raped woman who is left dead, and a milkman finds her body. He thought that was just too much violence to be showing to little kids. Another thing was he thought that there was a lot of subliminal messaging in comics. So this is an example from Jungle Comics #98, where he felt like the guy's shoulder. See how it's the guy's shoulder, but it also looks like a female body part. So he felt like they were putting in subliminal messages, like sexual messages to kids, and maybe negatively influencing them. Now, some of the comics actually did do that at that time. They thought it was like the artist would do it as a joke. So, there was some of that, but, it's one of those things where, artists do silly things. I've seen that done with Walt Disney movies where they'll actually put subliminal things, like they'll draw like a penis in the clouds or something like that, and they'll get it actually in the movie. And it'll be years later that they'll discover some weird inappropriate things for kids in Disney movies. Here's an example of a comic that I really like to get. This I don't have this one. This is Crime Detective Comics, and it's interesting because it's actually Wortham that's in bondage there. So he was actually annoyed by the fact that they were basically mocking him, because Wortham was a pretty vocal advocate for censorship of comics. So which is kind of, and this is another famous one, the Hangman cover. And there's an injury to eye. So as I was mentioning before, so these are some of the panels. So really interesting book. Lots of psychological reviews and like little stories that he told about different children and their influence, how they were influenced by comics. So probably that book is the most noted in terms of the historical relevance to relating to the end of the Golden Age and the Comic Code Authority being implemented. The next book is a little earlier, and I kind of wanted to mention this one, not because it actually led to anything negative. It wasn't a negative book at all. But it was one that basically sort of first looked at comics and really kind of brought people's attention to the influence of comics and to just the appreciation of comics in general. Actually, this is not a negative book at all. And this is The Comics. Okay. And this book came out about 10 years earlier. I think this is 1947, and Wortham's book is 1954. Yeah, this is 1947. And this book was interesting because, it actually had some color panels, which is nice. And it would just be sort of an appreciation of comics. And, I haven't read it yet. I haven't but I've read excerpts from it. But it just gives like a little bit of comic history. And I think it's an important book for that reason. So it gives like all these nice little panels. It's not one that people collect the books from it. It mainly focused on actually the newsprint comics, and not comic books in general. But it is a book that I believe is kind of influential in terms of getting people to look at comics, and maybe kind of led to people, looking at comics in potentially a negative way, even though it was very positive about comics. So this is The Comics from Colton Wong. And then, so I'm totally mispronouncing his name, but it's a very famous book, one that's quite sought after as well. Another one similar to Wortham's book, but looked at more cultural, from the cultural side and more from the sexy side and violent side, is Parade of Pleasure. And this is by Jeffrey Wagner. So this book, very similar to Wortham's book in its criticisms of comics in general. And it did have a pretty big influence on, encouraging the Senate hearings that led to the Comic Code Authority. And a lot of the cool thing about this book was, unlike Wortham's book, what happened was, with Wortham's book, there was actually an appendix where they listed out some of the publishers that were mentioned in the book. That when they actually published it, they at first had that little appendix, but then they decided to cut it out because they didn't want to get sued by all those publishers. So they ended up not releasing it with that appendix. If you can find a version with the appendix, it's actually quite valuable for the Seduction of the Innocent. But Wagner didn't have such restraint. So he openly put all the covers for some of the books that are mentioned inside, that illustrate the kinds of books that he felt were negatively impacting people, that were hypersexual or hyper-violent. He was really obsessed with that element of negative culture, and he kind of blamed it as American culture because he's British. And he sort of saw this American culture as being a negative influence on the world. And the interesting thing about the Parade of Pleasure is it's kind of broken into multiple parts, and comics are not the total focus of this book. So you got he's got like a section on comics where he kind of has these nice panels. And so you can see, but he also talks a lot about movies, and so he shows like some of the movies where it's women in bondage, sort of what he thought is extreme violence. I imagine he would be freaking out by the movies nowadays, right? Let me see if I can show you some more. So you see like some women fighting and, this extreme violence. He actually was commenting about how many scenes of violence were in particular movies. And he just thought that it was just, they were so extreme. Like it would be very mild compared to what we see nowadays. And then the other thing that he looked at was the pulps. So he had a separate section for just the pulps. And he looked at the pinups. Let's see if I can find the pinups. And these are some of the examples that he gave of the pinups that were like, not necessarily like Wortham was more focused on kids. With the Parade of Pleasure, it was more focused on people in general. So in a way, this book had much more of a impact in terms of that element, where he was talking about the whole influence over society as a whole, in general. And it's kind of interesting that he really broke down all the elements that he saw as being negative American cultural influences on the world. So if you're collecting these books, a lot of the labels, the CGC labels, will say pop, mentioned in pop. And this is Parade of Pleasure, so pop. So you'll see that on the label on CGC. On the SOTI books, it will say SOTI, S-O-T-I. So that's something to look for when you're buying these Golden Age books. That, is it mentioned in pop or is it mentioned in SOTI? So this is kind of an interesting one. Very, very cool book. I have read a bit of it. I haven't finished it yet, so I'm a little bit behind on my reading. So, but it's very interesting what I've read. I read, the first half of it maybe, and it's, he really does see the hyperviolence and hypersexuality as being a negative influence. So, very cool. The last book that I'm going to mention is not actually a book. It's a magazine. And it's this one right here, Reader's Digest. And I will be doing a separate video just on this book alone because it is major. This is Reader's Digest, June 1954. It's a one that you can pick up very cheap. Those other books, like easily $1,000 each. So they're all pretty pricey in the first editions. You can get later editions fairly affordably, but first editions fairly pricey. This book is a $10 book, so it's a very cheap one that you can pick up, and it's a very important one because this one was actually referenced in the Senate hearings, and the books that it mentions were mentioned in the Senate hearings. So inside, there's like a 4-page article called "For the Kiddies to Read," and I will do a separate video on this, and I'll actually read it so you can watch that video later. I'll do that video in a future upload, but for the kiddies to read. And it's an interesting article because unlike Wortham's book, which is kind of clinical, and Parade of Pleasure, which is kind of maybe a bit racy in terms of what people in the 50s would have been willing to read. It's got some not nudity, but it has like some, pin-up art and stuff like that. And it would be considered a bit racy for the time. So maybe the general public might not read it, or they might pick it up like women pick up 50 Shades of Grey kind of level, where they would pick it up as a guilty pleasure. Oh, what is this whole subculture? And they'd be kind of curious about it. And Wortham's book was very clinical, so might not have that mass appeal, even though it was very popular book, no doubt about it. But this book was everywhere because Reader's Digest had a huge circulation, and that's why it, in a way, kind of was a major influence on people's minds, because people would pick up it's one of the first articles within this copy of Reader's Digest. And you'd expect millions of people would have read this article back in the day. And the article is scathing. It is, it is brutal because it actually says, like, it mentions 3 books, really 2 books, but it's also doesn't stop there. it mentions the books, but then and it says this is what your kids are reading, and you should freak out, you know. But it goes further than that, and it actually says this is the actions you should take to stop, your kids from reading this filth, basically. And it really was aggressive in that respect. Much more avocation for like the censorship and the banning of books, more than Wortham's book, more than Prey to Pleasure. Prey to Pleasure really was bothered by it, but it really didn't take that avocation stance. It didn't, like, not to this level. This is like social justice kind of level, social justice warrior kind of level of book. So very major, and it was featured in the Senate hearings. So, and it's one that most people don't even know about, like nowadays, like, it's sort of under the radar. So, these were my 4 books that I believe had some of the most impact on comics and that led to the Comic Code Authority. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I will do videos later on each of those books individually, where I'll show hopefully the complete collections of each. I have a complete collection of the Reader's Digest ones, so that's why I can do that. Because it's the easiest one to do. It's like 2 books. It's pretty easy. Prey to Pleasure, I have about 5 or 6 books from it. And Seduction of the Innocent, I have about over 100, about 135 books from the Seduction of the Innocent. So I'm really been working on getting that whole collection. And, once I get that full collection, I will do a mega video, maybe a 2 or 3 part video with where I show the entire collection and explain the reasons for each book being mentioned in the Seduction of the Innocent. So that's my ultimate goal with the Seduction of the Innocent, but stay tuned for that for a later video. I'd love to hear people's feedback. What do you think about these 4 books? And, what do you think about comic book censorship and the Comic Code Authority? And do you think that they had some justification for the attitudes that they had towards comics? I'd love to hear that feedback, and put it in the comments below. And remember to like and subscribe as well. I appreciate it. Okay, thanks again. Bye.